So I'm thinking I should change my name tag so it doesn't say business research fellow or lecturer in politics, but responsible academic. And then on the days that I leave work early to go cycling, irresponsible academic. So my job here is really to talk through some of the nuts and bolts of what we're doing with the next panel sessions, to go through the idea of the case selection, the panel organization, the presentation framework, and then to talk a little bit about the Q&A. So I'm leaving the contextual stuff, the theoretical stuff to those who came before me, and getting stuck in a little bit about how we're organizing the rest of the day. So the first thing about the case selection is really, why are we looking at these dozen companies? Why these groups? Why these organizations? And really what it started with was the organizing committee brainstormed a list of companies that were really hitting this well-good scale. And maybe not always doing well, doing good, and doing it at scale, but we're doing distinctive practices in this area. Who are really doing something worthwhile or innovative that'll be worth talking about in this type of context. So that was really, we generated this long list and then invited organizations to come speak and had a really positive and overwhelming response. So I really thank you to all the speakers for being here and accepting that invitation. But what happened is that we didn't pick 10 organizations that are all in the same sector or 10 organizations that are all in the same region. So we've actually got quite a lot of heterogeneity in there. These organizations don't all look the same. They're not all the same size. But what makes it interesting, particularly for an academic perspective, is that they're all solving similar problems. They're all trying to crack this well-good scale puzzle, sometimes in similar areas, sometimes in similar ways. And so despite their heterogeneity, you get these cross-cutting themes. You get these practices that you start seeing across corporations. And that, for me as an academic, is really interesting. So they're solving similar problems. So that's how we did the case selection. In terms of the panel organization, we then had to break it up into these three groups. And Colin has already walked us through this, but just to reiterate, the first set is about driving purpose from the top down. And this isn't to say that all the organizations here don't have tremendous leadership that are bringing values, that are talking about sustainability. Just that the practices that we're talking about on this specific panel are really looking at governance, leadership, and core strategy of the firms. The second panel is looking at purposeful finance. And really, it's broken sort of into two mini panels with a 10-minute Q&A in between. And so the first, it's all about inclusive finance, so increasing access to banking and financial services. And this is something that's quite close to my heart, and some of my colleagues here who are looking at how do we improve asset financing? How do we improve people's ability to access financial instruments? And then the other group in that set of panels is looking at sustainable investment and impact investment. And this is really picking up a conversation that's become very big these days. And so I hope that generates some good questions and ideas from the audience. And then the final is looking at practices that are being driven by piloting, driven by sort of small programs that are hopefully influencing the core business. And actually that becomes a real question. How do these pilots drive change in a core business? How do they influence? What value do they bring? And so that's the final session, so looking at some really interesting piloting activities. So that's the panel organization. But then again, returning to this idea of heterogeneity. Again, these companies are all working in different sectors, looking at different things. And so the organizers asked all the presenters, very nicely, to use a presentation framework and to look at these 5 Ps, just so that we have a little bit of comparative points. So across these differences, we're looking at similar things. So the first piece is purpose. And this picks up a lot on what Colin was saying already. What is the purpose? What is the legitimate purpose of a firm? And I'm a political scientist, so saying legitimacy is a little bit dangerous, but what is the purpose of a firm? And then in each of these presentations, we're asking them to state the purpose for the program that they're talking about. What is this about? What's it trying to achieve? What's the vision? The next, and this for the students in the room is probably hopefully the most important, is the practices. What are the management practices that have made it possible for these companies to enter the sector or to be distinctive? So the idea is that there should be cross-pollination. So also the corporate representatives here hopefully will pick up some ideas from their peer organizations. So what are these practices that can be taken out of a very specific context and maybe brought in your work as you go forward or you return to the workplace? And the next is performance. Again, Colin, Jay, and Bruno have talked about this in a really effective way. It really is a two-part question for me. One, does this kind of responsible business, does it outperform conventional business practices? So there's sort of a head-to-head horse race question there, which is quite interesting. But then there's also a question of what is measured, what should be measured, and how does measuring certain non-financial aspects change the way you do business, change your practices. So performance is really interesting. And yeah, what are you using? Quantitative measures, are you using qualitative measures? How do they fit in? And then the final two are really about evaluating practice as it is. So what are the problems? Bruno used the metaphor of sports, getting back into shape, and I think that's a nice one. This isn't easy. These are hard nuts to crack. So what are the problems they've found along the way? And then prospects, what's next? Where do these pilots go? In development studies, there's this sort of a joke about a pilot is supposed to be the start of something. Does it ever grow? Does it ever scale? Do these pilots ever go anywhere? What happens going forward? What happens if there's another crash? So those are the basic framework for the presentations. And now I want to talk a little bit about the Q&A. So we've already mentioned that we're here at Oxford. So this is your chance to ask Oxford-like questions, hard questions. How should we define responsible business? What's new about this? This is one we keep on circling back to. What happens when values conflict? How should success be measured? So all of these questions are ones that should be coming up again and again. And I hope also to honor the experience of the MBAs in the room. So all of you guys, the average age of an MBA at Oxford, I think, is 29. So most people are coming after a few years of work experience, often in really innovative businesses. And so please bring that experience to challenge the presenters on stage in a nice way. So the Q&A. And then another question for the polling that we're doing. Who do you think are the strongest proponents of more responsible business? Senior executives, investors, regulators, consumers, and employees. So there's the voting for that. But without further ado, I'd like to invite Karen Hamilton to come speak.
So a couple of words first about Unilever. We're a global company. We have operations in over 100 countries. We have around 400 brands. Many of them are household names: Dove, Ben & Jerry's ice cream, Knorr, Flora, and Persil. And those brands are used around 2 billion times a day around the world. So the scale of impact is significant. Now, as a growing successful business, why do we need to change? I think it's a question that's been posed during the early morning sessions. What we have found is that business as usual is not going to work if you start to look at the long-term challenges that face our society, that face people, the people we serve, and our business, whether that's rising temperatures or reduced water, whether that's increased global food insecurity or increasing inequality. So we know that as we look to the long term, these big trends are going to hit us, and we can choose to proactively grasp them and plan and turn those risks into opportunities, or we can wait and be reactive. And as a signal of looking to the long term, in 2009, our CEO, Paul Polman, who's pictured here, announced to the financial markets that he was no longer going to give quarterly financial guidance, something that hit our share price at the time. And at about the same time, of course, in the middle of the global economic crisis, we set out a new purpose and vision for the company. And that vision is to double the size of our business whilst reducing our environmental footprint and increasing our positive social impact. And in order to make that more tangible, we set out a plan. We call it the Unilever Sustainable Living Plan. We launched it in 2010, and in effect, it's our blueprint for how we deliver on this vision. Now, many people asked us at the time, and still ask, well, isn't there a conflict between doing business and sustainability? What actually is the business case? And 5 years in, we're still finding that a challenge with our own management today. It's not that straightforward, because we're trying to create a mindset shift from, if you like, having your business agenda here and your corporate social responsibility agenda here, to a fusion between the two. And so we've tried to frame, if you like, how sustainability creates business success. And we've done it in this incredibly simple four value driver framework. More growth, lower costs, less risk, and more trust. And we've found that that is helping our own management to articulate for themselves the different ways in which they can drive business success through sustainability. And we've got some evidence of that as well. So when we look at the way in which we've cut energy use, water use, and waste in our factories, that has saved us money, and it's cut our costs to the tune of about 600 million over the last few years. When we look at how we make ourselves more resilient to some of the longer-term risks, one as a large food company, where around half of our raw materials are coming from farming and forests, we're doing that through increasing the amount of materials that we buy. We want to source those sustainably, and that's what we're progressively doing. And when it comes to trust, we're finding that our new vision is attracting top talent around the world. But what about growth? Because at the end of the day, that's the key question on every manager's mind, but is it going to drive my growth? And as a consumer goods company, brands are at the heart of our business. You heard me say that we have 400 or so brands, many of them household names. And there's a lot of talk in the marketing world around purpose-led brands, responsible brands, but people have varying definitions of what they mean by that. So we decided that we wanted to set out a systematic definition or methodology of what we mean by a purposeful brand, and we call them sustainable living brands because that fits with our own plan. And for us, a sustainable living brand is one that not only integrates sustainability into its marketing platform, but also into its products. And the way we look at purpose is that purpose is activating and engaging consumers in a way that's taking measurable action, that's relevant for the brand, that's good for society, and that's meaningful for the people who buy our products. And at the same time, that it's also providing products which are contributing to the Unilever Sustainable Living Plan goals. So that's what we call a sustainable living brand, and we have lots of different brands in the company. This is an example of one of our sustainable living brands, Dove. It's a personal care brand. It sells soaps, shampoos, and body wash and deodorant. And when it comes to the brand's purpose, what Dove believes is that it wants women to feel confidence, not anxiety, about their appearance. And one of the ways in which it's doing that is by creating a self-esteem program for young people. And so far it's reached about 15 million young people through different avenues, through schools, through the Girl Guides, associations, and so on. And at the same time, it was one of our first brands to launch a compressed deodorant spray. And the compressed deodorant spray cuts materials very significantly versus the standard one and cuts CO2 emissions by about 25%. So this is an example of one of several of our brands. Knorr, the soups and bouillon cubes brand is another. Ben & Jerry's ice cream is another. When we analysed the performance of our sustainable living brands in 2014, we found that the sustainable living brands were growing twice as fast as the rest of our business and contributed almost half our growth. Of the top 30 brands in our company, we saw that we had about 11 sustainable living brands in 2014. And probably when we look back to when we launched the Unilever Sustainable Living Plan in 2010, we think that we maybe had 2, 3, or 4 brands. So that's also a measure of the progress that we're making. But as you can hear, there's a long way to go. Now, when it comes to our plan, we also wanted to set tangible goals around which both our brands, their marketing and R&D teams, and our supply chain operations could focus so that we know exactly what the frame is. And so we've set out social, environmental, and economic goals. Firstly, to help more than 1 billion people to take action to improve their health and well-being. Secondly, to halve the environmental footprint of our products through the value chain, from the sourcing of raw materials to the way that consumers use the products. And then thirdly, to enhance the livelihoods of millions of people across that value chain, not only in our own operations, but also upstream, if you like, with farmers, and downstream with small-scale retailers. So those are our goals. And how are we doing against them? Well, we've just measured our 2015 performance. And here's a quick snapshot. When it comes to health and well-being, we're making some good progress. We've reached 482 million people with a series of different interventions, but primarily around Lifebuoy, our germ kill soap, that engages in what's probably the world's largest hand washing education program. On the second one, our progress is much more mixed. So good in our manufacturing operations. Last year, we achieved zero non-hazardous waste to landfill across all our factories worldwide. We cut our CO2 emissions significantly by around 37%. But not so good when in the areas which are not in our direct control. So when it comes to halving the greenhouse gas footprint of our products, you can see there that we've increased that, in fact, not decreased it by 6%. And again, that's largely because most of our life cycle emissions of our products is related to the heating up of water for showering, for washing your laundry in the washing machine, for example. And we're finding those areas that are outside our control much more difficult to tackle. And then finally, we've made good progress on enhancing the livelihoods of people, reaching 600,000 smallholder farmers and 1.8 million small-scale retailers with a series of different initiatives. So I'd like to end really with a reflection, I guess, and 2 or 3 questions on the problems that we're facing. The first is around this challenge that, as I described, we still have within the company, and which I think is fundamental to the successful operation of sustainable business, which is that not only do you need the moral case, but you must also be motivated by the business case, and that business case needs to work for your approach, your programs to be sustainable in the long term and for you to actually scale up from pilot and beyond. The second is, as a consumer goods business, consumers' responses are really important. We're always looking at what consumers' needs are. And in this area, there's a gap between what people say and then their purchasing behavior, something that we're continually trying to find out more about so that we can really close that gap. And then thirdly, although we can make progress in our own business, the big challenges that society faces are much too large for one organization alone, and we've realized that on our journey. And so we've committed to not only making internal change, but also in selected areas where it's relevant to our business, being part of creating more transformational change. And by that I mean change to whole systems, rather than only incremental change within the business. And of course that means very deep collaboration across civil society, NGOs, governments, and peer companies. Thank you very much.
Thank you, and now I'd like to invite Yassine.
So I'm part of the same team as Bruno and Jay, and I had the privilege to actually participate, and this is how this story started, to a program that was created by our pet care group. And that program was to say, okay, there are probably very big changes ahead, big challenges to our traditional business model, big opportunities too. So why don't we go out there and try to learn from other companies? So they deputized a group of 20 people from the business, from every area of the business, to actually send them out and visit something like 30 different companies, from startups to 100-year-old big companies, from companies in all the continents, to try to understand what makes them special or unique. And each one of these companies or groups of companies, we had a reason to go and see them. So I'm going to start by the reason not to go to see them. Originally, when we went to see the group called Mahindra, one thing that was clearly not on our radar screen was this approach to purpose, because frankly, we did not understand what it meant, okay? When you listen to what the Mahindra founder, Anand Mahindra, says, he says, Mahindra is many companies with just one purpose, enabling people to ride. Like, what does that mean? Okay, so let us explore this a bit. So Mahindra is a group that was founded in 1945 as a steel trading company. And it has diversified in many areas, from agriculture to automotive to finance. And they're now a relatively large group operating in many different areas. And what was really interesting, and that's why we actually went to see them originally, we wanted to understand how they managed a successful mix of businesses that are at different stages of development. Because this actually is quite hard for many companies, according to what we've been able to observe. How do you manage both internal startups and very established business units, and business units that are in the middle of growing, that are mid-size? Okay, so we went to them and tried to figure that out. Okay, so again, they started with something that we did not really understand, which was these mantras. This is, we have 3 mantras. Accept no limits, think alternatively, Apple anyone? And drive positive change. Now, what does that mean? Okay, that's not very easy to understand. But then we started to get into the heart of things. And one of the first things that we observed that started to make sense to us is the ecosystem-first approach. So their approach to this says, disruptive growth only comes from addressing unmet or emerging needs in an ecosystem. So that's one of the key starting insights, and this is one of the key central beliefs in their company, and we're going to illustrate how that actually manifests. But that's a very important thing. So basically, they look at the ecosystem first. Okay, so let's see what that will mean. So when we told them, okay, so kind of breaking down for us, please. They started by saying, yes, we've heard about RISE. You've heard about our 3 mantras. But when basically you take, I don't know, a logistics manager or a small business unit manager and tell him, go do good, go make people rise, it's very hard for him to do that. So there is a strong need for translation of what the purpose means in business terms, how we're going to do that at different levels of the organization. And in their perspective, and we're going to see today a business case that is one of their internal startups. It's called Mahindra First Choice, and it is their multi-brand used car business. Okay? And what they did is, okay, I'm going to translate my purpose into something that makes easier sense to the people that are going to work on it. We want you to go build and dominate, okay, harsh, huh? The used car ecosystem in India. Okay, it's a bit scary, but let's see what that means. The second thing we've observed is says, okay, if you really want to go ecosystem first and you really want to innovate, you need to have a long-term perspective and somebody who provides air cover for these innovative small startups to rise. And so basically, these companies I'm going to talk to you about, they've been in the red for more than 7 years before they started making money, and they were still considered a success in the way that they worked until today. And we're getting to the heart of the thing by talking about the ecosystem shaping as a business model. Remember, if growth only comes from addressing unmet needs in an ecosystem, we need to understand those needs, right? So how do you do that? 3 steps: map the ecosystem. Who are the stakeholders? Second step, identify their challenges and pain points. Third step, address them. How does that look?
I'm a middle-class worker in India and earn less than $500 per month. I want to buy a cheaper used car, but I don't want to just buy somebody else's problem. I'm really nervous about the condition of the cars on sale. If something goes wrong, the repair shops here are useless. They are always late. Oh, and a colleague once bought a used car, only to realize later that the paperwork was fake and he was conned.
I've used my car for a few years now. I just got a raise and a second child and would love to get one of the new Toyotas if I get a good price on my current one.
Business is tough. No matter how hard I work, I barely earn enough to keep this place open.
I had to tell an angry customer that, again, the manufacturer did not deliver the spare part, so I can't fix his car. I have to get back to work. Half of my staff has been replaced in the last few months, and I have to go teach the basics to the new guys again.
We don't want a new competitor here. Go to smaller cities where we don't sell anyway. Well, I need to go back to my meeting. the competition authorities won't leave us alone.
To give a loan, I need to know how much the car is worth in case the buyer defaults on his payments. And the whole repossession and resale business is such a hassle for everyone.
Pretty good American accents for Indian people. Yes? But that being said, this is basically the exercise they went through in understanding the pain points of each stakeholder of their ecosystem. Okay? So that's a bit of a summary of what we've seen so far. Okay, so I won't go through them again, but I want to basically go through what it took for them to work this through. So they say, okay, now we need to design solutions for these problems. The biggest problem, the trust deficit. How can I trust the condition of the car and everything? So what they started with a very simple car inspection service. 80, check the box, easy to train people, less than $10. I tell you if your car is in good condition or in crap condition. Okay, great. Now they said, let's look at these guys, the independent car dealers. They have problem attracting people. Let's help them. We'll create a multi-brand car dealer franchise. So we will lend them our scale, well-recognized brand and try to basically figure out how we can help them rebuild a little bit of trust. And by doing that, I'm actually equipping them with my IT system. I'm also equipping them with my car inspection service, and let's see what that goes. Now, I have an inspection service, means I know the condition of the car, means I can price a warranty. And once I price a warranty, I can use it to reassure the consumer who is buying, but also share the profits with the dealer and try to attack their bottom line problem and their profitability problem. Okay, next, I told you they had this franchise and they installed IT system. What that allows them to do is to collect all the transactional data. What that gives them is a benchmark of used car prices. Okay, so I need a Toyota, 3 years, 100,000 kilometers. This is the price. Okay, this is the fair price in a sense, based on other existing. So they created a huge transparency in the ecosystem by providing this Indian Blue Book pricing system online for free. So they created this data asset, collected it, converted it into a free asset for the whole ecosystem, again, to fix the trust deficit in this ecosystem, both for the consumers but also for the bank, so that they can give easier loan. Talking about the bank, remember he said that reselling the repossessed cars is a big hassle. It's not only how much money I get, it's like how do I sell this car? They went out and created a B2B auction platform, like an eBay for used cars, so that banks could get rid of these cars faster and therefore make it easier for these people, for the banks to get their money back, and consequently for them easier to be able to give loans also more easily. Next step, okay, this one is one of my favorites. They went to basically, when they saw the situation for the car servicing workshops, they said, okay, this service is really terrible. We're going to show them how it's done. So they opened their own car servicing workshops. And 2 years later, they started closing them because they were not doing better than the independent workshop next door. So what they've learned from this failure is that the main pain point was not, okay, are these guys competent? Is these guys do not have the spare parts to fix the cars. So the problem is not to create a high quality, you know, the Starbucks standardized service of cars. They needed to create the FedEx for spare parts. So they turned around and pivoted their servicing workshops into a hub and spoke supply chain. If that's what the ecosystem needs, that's what we're going to provide. But to do that, they needed to go convince these guys to give them enough access to their spare parts. How did they do that? They told them, look, you're Volkswagen or Toyota. You cannot open in these small cities because there's not enough demand for Toyota or Volkswagen to build one dealer. But we are multi-brand. We don't care about the brand. So we are, actually, the combined demand is enough for us to open there. What do we do with that? Let us give you a couple of parking spaces, and you can put your new cars there, and we can sell them. So actually, we're not your competitors. We're the guys who are going to allow you to double or triple your geographical footprint. And give us access to your spare parts. And what we're going to do is that we're going to help you make the case with the competition authorities that you're playing nicely with the ecosystem. And consequently, so they were able to actually convince the car manufacturers to come on board and to help them provide this hub and spoke supply chain. So basically, to get a part delivered, if you work with Mahindra, it's not 35 days maybe, it's 9 days guaranteed. But supply chain needs scale to work, so they created also a franchise for these guys, okay? So that they had this the scale to make the supply chain work. And when they started working with the garages, you remember the employee training problem? So people would leave. There is a very high churn in low-income and low-training employees. So what they've created is almost like, think of it as a YouTube how-to for how to repair the car. So the car comes in, he scans the reference point, he says, okay, check this, this green, blue, do this, do that, etc. So effectively what they've done is that they've embedded a lot of the knowledge in a system, which allows for much faster training within these garages, and it dramatically increased the quality of service of their franchisees. And of course, there is a strong partnership with car manufacturers. So for the sake of time, we'll try to go quickly through the next parts. Basically, if I look at everything that they've designed, it looks like a mishmash of uncorrelated stuff. Unless you look at the needs they were trying to design for, there is no way you understand how these things combine. But all of them play a certain role in creating a bit of trust and transparency, either between organizations or between consumers and these organizations. So that's one thing. The second thing is part of the franchise is actually creating a platform for collective actions. So big part of their business is cross-referrals. I don't have this car here, but go see my friend there, he has it, etc. And that's another aspect that they've created, a dynamic that they've created. The diagnosis system and the car inspection service both are very powerful training tools, not just standardization. And last but not least, they measure themselves against the business performance of the car manufacturers, the franchisees. So basically, they measure themselves against the performance of their partners. And that's shared financial performance. So if I look at these whole things, and going back to the framework that Bruno and Jay presented this morning, those two are part of social capital. This one delivers a kind of human capital, and the last one is straight in the middle of shared financial capital. Okay? In terms of performance, interestingly enough, so they're growing way ahead of the used car business in India. And they've increased the profits and business of all their partners, and that's what they measure. Unfortunately, they don't measure their impact on human and social capital. Even if, in a sense, they designed for it, for them it's a kind of a business framework that they're applying, and they measure themselves against the ecosystem growth overall. In terms of prospects and challenges, so now, as they are started legitimizing used cars in India, it creates a space for copycats. So they have to start dealing with that, online pure players. There is a threat of Uber-like services in India that they are starting to deal with too. And their rudimentary measurement of non-financial capital is one area where we see that basically there's potential for improvement there. So that's basically I probably will want to leave the questions for later since I'm up. All right.
First off, thank you to all the panelists. Really interesting discussions and really interesting links across quite different organizations. So now it's my pleasure to open up the floor for question and answer. And we've got Simon in the front, has some mics, and we'll take questions in groups of 3 and then have the panel respond and then do another set of 3.
Could I just ask a simple question about Mahindra? Much of what, and let me say I'm David Vines, I teach economics in this university. And much of this morning has been about focus and purpose, or rather purpose, and I have read into that the need to focus. Why is this steel trading company doing so many things? Is there a focus issue, and how is that resolved?
Great. Thank you to everyone in the audience. We've got a question on embedded values, and then the question of why is Mahindra doing so many things? And then the final question was on focus and purpose with Mahindra.
Yeah. So, as you saw that quote at the beginning, Mahindra is multiple companies with one purpose. So these are clearly different people. Not like you don't have the same people working on multiple Mahindra businesses. So talking about focus, each person that you talk to is very focused on what they do, right? Because it's their startup, or it's their mid-sized business, or their huge business. So in a sense, what they communicate to them through most of their leadership programs, etc., is their ecosystem shaping approach at the service of kind of affecting positive change or holistic approach. That's the main common point, is that this approach is applied in rural finance the same way that it is applied in used cars, same way it is applied in other areas. So in a sense, you are right that there are multiple companies that all focus on very different things. It doesn't prevent them from being focused, because these are completely different people. Sometimes, like the Mahindra First Choice startups, they're even funded as a separate legal entity, with part of the funding coming from VCs, just to have a valuation of the value of the company, because it's not easy when it's funded through internal capital. So I don't think there is a lack of focus. There is more of a silo approach in terms of focus and business. The only common point being that they need to demonstrate to the board and Anand Mahindra that they're following the 3 mantras of affecting positive change, thinking alternatively, and accepting no limits. And it might sound a bit artificial, but that's basically the way they're organized.
Excellent. So let's do another round of questions. We'll do the gentleman in the glasses, the woman up front, and then you, sir. In whatever order.
I'm Alex Lloyd-Davis from Openwell. I think a great enemy of responsible business is quarterly reporting, because it strikes me a lot of these great case studies are either family companies or ones that aren't having to do quarterly reporting. So my question, particularly for Karen, was how important you felt Paul Polman's stand on saying we are not going to do quarterly reporting, we are going to start focusing on this stuff. How important that was in setting that direction, and whether you'd encourage other companies to kind of take that courageous stand.
Thank you. And then
hi, I'm Marcello Palazzi from the B Corps. Question is, we always seem to go back to this reference point, which is the profit maximization. So how do we change these terms of reference? And my question specifically to the panel is, we heard from Unilever, Paul Polman said, if you don't like our shares, you can sell our shares. You know, they know where you choose your shareholders. The question is to Mahindra or to Novo Nordisk, do the leaders of your companies openly talk about profit is one of the objectives, but there are multiple objectives? And are they open about this? Because I think we need to change the terms of the debate and not always get stuck into, hey, it's measuring ourselves versus the profit maximization ideology.
Thank you. So Karen, you got off easy the first round, but they got you the second time. So the first question is about the increased awareness of chemicals in detergents and what Unilever is doing around this issue.
Yeah, great question. So I guess the first thing to say is what are we doing about chemicals in detergents and in our other products, and what's our approach? Because the first principle we have as a business is to not use ingredients that could be harmful to human health, and to seek to use ingredients which are going to, if they're going into the water system, will biodegrade. So we have a long-established team. It's decades old, called our Safety and Environmental Assurance Centre. They're a team inside Unilever, but they're treated as independent from the rest of the organisation. And within them are researchers who are either experts in human health and safety, or they're life cycle scientists, or they have other forms of expertise in this area. And every product that we release onto the market is reviewed by them against a set of criteria. So I can check back on the specific product that you described there, and indeed you can. But I would be confident that we're not using in that laundry detergent materials that are carcinogenic and that degrade and have an issue in the water, because it's something we take so seriously. But it's difficult for the independent companies who are launching apps which look at company by company to be able to make those judgments themselves, which is what they generally need to do in order to be independent. So it's, so one of the things that we're conscious of is that we need to provide more information, because I think you're absolutely right that the trend today is a hunger for more transparency and for more information. And I think increasingly we're getting there. And if you look at our website, unilever.com, you'll see a fair amount of information already available. So I think of course, the digital revolution has opened up the opportunity for, quite rightly, for scrutiny and for greater understanding of what is behind the brands, if you like, and a look at their value chain. I think that's very healthy, and I think it also it means that companies need to step up to the mark and need to be much more proactive, and that's what we're seeking to do.
Thank you. And then we can move to Alex's question, which is about quarterly reporting. Is that a great evil?
So we still track our performance quarterly. I think that's probably worth saying. Of course, we're tracking our own performance internally on a daily, weekly, and monthly basis. So we're still doing performance tracking of sales at that level. But yes, it was a very important signal at the point that our CEO said that. Because I think it was, as much as anything, symbolic of a strategic intention that we were putting our consumers first in the way in which we ran the business, and I think that was referenced earlier in terms of the sort of logic, and that we have built that also into the mission of our company, is the approach that, if you like, whose needs are we really meeting? We're meeting people's needs, and if we do that right, and then eventually it will trickle down and be good for shareholders as well. So it was and is an important signal. But if just doing that's not enough.
And then Marcelo's question on profit maximization and how to change the terms of reference. Are these discussions that are going on at Mahindra?
In the case of Mahindra, and I try to convey that, is they don't measure themselves against social outcomes. They talk about them, but don't measure themselves. What is interesting is that they measure themselves against the health of the ecosystem, how many transactions are happening, what is the profit of our partners, or the sales of our partners. So this shared financial performance is one of the key artifacts that can be held as one of the elements that they do. And most of it goes through, so if talking about the change of paradigm, it's not maximizing profit, it all boils down to their strong belief, and it's a business principle, that you grow by addressing the unmet needs in the ecosystem. So you become the orchestrator, and if the ecosystem grows, the orchestrator grows. So this kind of almost two-step process of grow the ecosystem first. If you do it right, you'll be able to recapture that value, is one of the ways that they tackle this profit maximization approach. Like, yes, but it's almost a lagging indicator of the health and size of the ecosystem you're orchestrating.
Simon, do we have questions from Twitter?
We do have questions coming through.
Hey.
One question from Eve, and this is for you again, Karen, regarding Unilever. And the question was, you said that there was a reduction of 50% in terms of environmental impact on products. How does that equate to production as a whole?
Okay.
Let's take two more questions to add to that. And I think that'll be our final round of questions for this panel. So the gentleman in the blue shirt and the gentleman in the white shirt at the back. You guys can coordinate. Please go ahead.
So a lot of what you've spoken about, or that's been spoken about so far, is principally sustainability related, less so than responsibility. So if we put that in the framework, particularly of the global financial crisis, there was a lot of the responsibility was driven by market reaction and then post-event intervention. So how have the frameworks, particularly within organizations now, changed to enable the business and people within the business to ensure that there's appropriate accountability within the organization?
Thank you. And then up at the top.
Yeah. So Matthew Frost, I guess I'm a recovering chief executive. So my question is, I guess, to the whole panel, but maybe especially Karen. So can a focus on responsible, sustainable business of the kind imagined by this conference, so fully integrated, really be sustained over the long haul through good times and tougher times without fundamentally reimagining the underlying ownership, governance and legal form, but also in really fundamentally shaping and reimagining the mindsets of investors, especially the fund managers, as well as the underlying investors? I'd love to hear how you're thinking about this, whether you are thinking about this.
Excellent. Wonderful questions again. So we can start with Eve's question about the reduction of outputs and how that related to production.
Okay, so we've set ourselves a goal to halve the environmental impact of our products. And we also have separate targets specifically for our manufacturing operations. And I get, but what we felt was that as a business, our manufacturing greenhouse gas emissions are relatively small in comparison to the effect that we have in the business decisions we make across the total value chain, which is why we've set these two separate targets, so one for manufacturing and one for across the value chain. And so I think the one that's really relevant here is to look at greenhouse gas emissions. So we have measured the life cycle emissions of a representative sample of our products, 3,000 products in 14 different countries. We looked at them from raw material through to consumer use, so that means that we looked at varying consumer habits and energy grids depending on those 14 countries. And we were able, as a result of that, to get a picture by extrapolating out from that of the shape of Unilever's greenhouse gas emissions for products across the value chain. And what we learned was that our manufacturing emissions are less than 5% of our total greenhouse gas emissions. About 25% of the emissions are upstream in the way that we source our raw materials, especially from farming and forestry, and about 2/3 are downstream in the way that consumers use our products. And as I referenced before, that's mainly heating of water for our shower gels, body washes, shampoos, and so on. So with it, that doesn't mean that, so we focus first on what's in our own house, if you like, on our factories, and cutting emissions in our own factories. But having done that value chain analysis, we know that's not enough, however much we cut that down. Having said that, we're finding going beyond our own direct control incredibly hard, which is why we've not made much progress there yet.
And the next question was about the influence of the global financial crisis on accountability practices and whether it spurred change within any of these organizations.
I think for Unilever, it was one of the triggers for that announcement about quarterly reporting because it seemed to come at a relevant time to rethink that for us. But otherwise, it's interesting in a way, you know, we had been developing behind the scenes for some time our new purpose and vision and the Unilever Sustainable Living Plan well before the economic crisis hit, and happened that in a way the two coincided, which was probably quite important for the kind of the values and spirit of the company, I think.
And then we have a really wonderful closing question for this panel, which is really about the sustainability of these practices and whether to have them sustained it needs to be changes in governance, legal forms, mindsets, investment practices. If any reflections on those, please, Steve.
Reflection read Colin's book. This is what it's all about. Yeah.
Yeah. And I guess for me, this is you know, a really big question, isn't it? We have been quite concerned in recent years that you know, that the tough questions that could be rightly asked of us as Unilever is, you know, are you putting too much effort into this sustainability thing, and into, you know, at the risk to your business results? And although we're absolutely convinced that there's not a trade-off between the two, in fact, that we believe that long-term we get superior performance from combining the two, that has and continues to be the right but tough question to ask. I've seen a real shift in the mindsets of investors in the last 12 months, I guess, and really in the run-up to the climate change conference in Paris, because I think that so much data and research came out which provided the evidence of the risk that society faces from the effects of climate change. And that for us has clearly shifted the mindsets of investors. And I'm not sure I can comment on fund managers. I'm not close enough to it. Do we need to change the business model for tough times as well as good times? At the moment, you know, our view is no. Actually, we make the business. You know, we're very passionate about making the business model that we have work, but we know that the system isn't right. So, and we're part of that system, and it makes us, you know, and so something has to change, and it may well be that, as you say, that in order to sustain and to have a number of companies who are operating in increasingly more sustainable ways, that that the kind of structure has to change as well.
Thank you. And now it's my pleasure to invite Colin and Bruno on stage to make some summary comments before releasing us all to the next break.
Okay, so the objective of this is for Bruno and I to just briefly give what we think are the main takeaways from each of the sessions. And the one that were the four that really struck me about this one. The first one was in terms of the importance of embedding the purpose in what actually goes on in the organization. Most clearly illustrated by what Karen was saying in relation to Unilever in terms of putting it into the brands, into the supply chain, into the well-being of customers, into the well-being of those in the supply chain. But then we heard that it's actually more than that. It goes beyond what happens in the supply chain or in the company to the whole of the ecosystem within which the firm is operating. And that came across very clearly in relation to both Mahindra and was described in terms of identifying the pain points and then tackling the pain points and working together with a variety of different parties, with distributors, manufacturers, with civil society, with cities, with universities, to create that ecosystem and address those pain points. And to my mind, that is what one might describe as being part of the process of internalizing the externalities. The third element is the importance of the long-term ownership and stability that comes from that ownership. That, as a number of the presenters said, the returns from these types of activities are often very long-term, take a long term to come to fruition. And one therefore needs to have an ownership structure that is committed to that long-term development of the business. And that was reflected and discussed in terms of the values of the business, in particular in relation to the industrial foundation. The final element was measurement, performance metrics. And it was interesting that many of the companies found this difficult. There was a sense it's important, but actually getting the measures is not straightforward. But there's one form of capital that I think came across from all of the presentations as being a key element of success and influence, and that is the development of trust, which one might regard as being a form of social capital, but that seemed to be a very common element that was an important part of gaining advantage from these activities.
Thank you, Colin. I just would like to add a couple of things to help compare what we've seen over the last hour. There are some similarities between what these three cases that we saw. The similarity is that these businesses are not only principle-led business, but they are also purpose-led business. And there is a high level of acceptance of how the purpose is being interpreted and understood by the different companies and by the different people working in these companies. Second one is that actually there is also, all these businesses are very performant. So there is here two data points of like purpose-led business and also very good performance from a traditional financial perspective. Then there are also some similarities in the way the practices take place. I mean, there is this concept of ecosystem shaping, this concept at different degrees. I mean, Mahindra is on the level 2, and we can hear also from Unilever that there is this interest of tapping into the ecosystem in which we operate. And this is actually redefining the boundaries of business, which are traditionally and artificially set to be limited between the world of the company. But here, when you talk about responsibility, it's actually being responsible of what we are not necessarily or legally responsible for. And I think this is an element here of responsibility that extends to the traditional boundaries of the business. And the last bit, actually, which I look from my research perspective, is that we talk a lot about human capital and social capital that these companies mobilized to run strategy, but also in which they invested. So here, in a sense, it's not a proof, it's just a data point that the mobilization and investment on social human capital strategies actually is not detrimental to your business. It is just the opposite. Now, the differences are in terms of governance. And it's very interesting to see because you had here three types of different ownership. And nevertheless, of course, some governance are more conducive to some strategies, but nevertheless, we can see here that governance is an important component, but does not prevent companies from doing good. Second one is that we also have a range of practices. I am particularly impressed by the work that Unilever did in turning the purpose into brands. And the journey from the purpose to the corporate brand, to the commercial brands, is a very interesting practice, which actually will certainly inform the way marketing is being taught in the coming years. Interestingly enough, the 11 brands that have embedded this purpose happen to perform better. So another data point that actually the two doing good and doing well are not in opposition. Then, of course, the concept of ecosystem shaping is at the core of what we're doing here. It's all about partnership. And behind partnership, what you have how you build relationship. It's all about trust, it's all about social cohesion, it's all about collective actions, which actually are the three components of social capital. So I think here, as a conclusion, time is up, I think there is here an element that there is an opportunity here to think about how the model can be completed. Here we have like the different anecdotes of businesses that actually are trying to shed that space, and it's all about completing the management model. And I will finish with a quote from my first boss at Mars, who is a wonderful Scottish guy. He said, well, the journey from ignorance to enlightenment is like the journey from astrology to astronomy. And we are in the middle.